My earliest memories are filled with scenes that always made it clear to me that my mum loved my brother more than she ever loved me. I remember being 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a coloring book while the smell of fried chicken drifted through the air, and my mum's laughter echoed from the living room. She was laughing at one of my brother's silly jokes. He was only 10, but he had this way of making her smile, of making her whole face light up like he was the most precious thing in her world. I would try to tell her about my drawings, about the little flowers I carefully colored in pink and yellow, but she would nod absent-mindedly and return her full attention to him. Even then I noticed it, even then I felt that weight in my chest that said I was second best in her eyes. When birthdays came around, the difference was undeniable. For my brother, she would bake a double-layer cake with his favorite blue frosting, invite his friends over, fill the house with balloons, and sing louder than anyone else when it was time for him to blow out the candles. For me, the celebrations were smaller, quieter, almost as though she was going through the motions out of obligation. I once asked her why my cake didn't have as many candles or decorations, and she told me it was because boys need more fuss, girls don't mind simple things. I didn't argue, but I never forgot those words. I tried to earn her love in different ways. I studied hard, brought home good grades, cleaned the house without being asked, and helped her fold laundry late at night. She always thanked me, but the gratitude was hollow, like the way you thank a stranger holding the door open for you. With my brother, her love wasn't just words. It was warmth, touches, looks of pride that I craved but rarely received. One day in middle school, I won a writing competition. I was so proud I rushed home clutching the certificate, expecting maybe for once she would see me, really see me. She smiled, told me, "That's nice," then turned to my brother and asked how his basketball game had gone that day. I remember standing there holding the paper, feeling like I was invisible. He hadn't even scored that game, but she still told him she was proud. I went upstairs and cried into my pillow, the certificate crumpled in my hands, wondering what was so wrong with me that I couldn't make her feel the same way she felt for him. The favoritism shaped our whole dynamic as a family. My father worked long hours, sometimes traveling for weeks, so it was mostly just Mum, my brother and me at home. And in that triangle, it was always clear who she stood closest to. When he broke the rules, she laughed it off, saying, "Boys will be boys." When I made the smallest mistake, I was scolded, lectured, sometimes even grounded. He was the golden child. I was the reminder that she had another responsibility besides him. There were nights I would lie awake listening to their conversations drifting down the hallway. She'd ask him about his day, his friends, his dreams for the future. She'd tell him how smart he was, how talented, how much potential he had. I'd pull the covers over my head and imagine her saying those things to me instead, whispering them like a secret meant only for me. But those words never came. Still, I tried to be a good sister to him. I helped him with homework, lent him my allowance when he wanted snacks, defended him when kids at school picked on him. But deep down I carried this resentment that he had everything I wanted without even trying. He didn't ask for her love, but it was handed to him freely. I begged for it silently, and it never arrived. The older we got, the more obvious it became. She bragged about his achievements to neighbors, to relatives, to anyone who would listen. My successes were barely mentioned, often overshadowed by even his smallest victories. I told myself it didn't matter, that I would grow strong without her approval. But that wasn't the truth. It did matter. It mattered more than anything. And it carved a hollow place inside me that I carried everywhere I went. What I didn't know then, what none of us could have known, was that the pedestal she put him on would one day crack. That the boy she adored beyond measure would be the one to betray her in ways she never imagined. And when that day came, I would be there, not to comfort her, but to finally let her see what her blind love had cost both of us. As we got older, the distance between me and my mum grew more obvious, and I realized I had become used to swallowing my hurt, because whenever I tried to talk about it, she would laugh softly and tell me I was being dramatic, or that I should be thankful for what I had. And of course I was thankful, but gratitude never filled the hole that was left every time I watched her face glow for my brother in a way it never did for me. High school only sharpened the difference because my brother was the star athlete of our town, and my mum lived for his games, painting her nails in the school colors, wearing his jersey in the stands, screaming his name like her life depended on it, while I walked home from debate competitions or writing events clutching little trophies that no one cared about. I remember once in sophomore year I was given an award for an essay about resilience, and I rushed home with the certificate trembling in my hands because I thought maybe she would be proud this time. But when I walked in, she barely looked up from the phone where she was texting my brother's coach about the next game and simply said, "That's nice, honey," before asking if I could iron his uniform for tomorrow. And in that moment something inside me broke and I wanted to scream, but instead I did what she asked. There was another night in winter when the air was icy and the snow crunched beneath my shoes as I dragged myself home from the regional writing contest where I had placed second, and I carried that little silver medal in my pocket like it was a secret treasure. And when I stepped through the door, the house was full of noise, laughter, and the smell of pizza because my brother had scored 2 points in his game that night and Mum had invited neighbors over to celebrate, and no one even noticed when I slipped upstairs to my room. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to their voices downstairs while the medal dug into my palm, and I realized that no matter how hard I tried, I would always be invisible compared to him. Even in the smallest thing, she chose him over me, like when there was only one piece of cake left, she gave it to him, saying he was growing and needed it more. Or when we argued, she always took his side before even hearing mine, telling me to be the bigger person, because I was the older sister and I needed to set an example. I carried that sentence like a burden. Be the bigger person. Be the one who lets go, be the one who understands, but who was ever bigger for me, who understood me, who let me win just once. Over time I stopped expecting fairness and simply learned how to make myself small so that her favoritism wouldn't hurt as much. But the truth is, it always did. And deep down I wondered if she even realized what she was doing, or if in her eyes my brother was truly the sun, and I was just something orbiting around him trying to catch a bit of warmth that never reached me. By the time I was in my last years of high school, I had already accepted that nothing I did would ever shine as brightly in my mum's eyes as anything my brother touched, and it hurt in ways I could not explain because I knew I was working twice as hard for half the recognition, and still came up short every time. But somehow I kept pushing myself, thinking maybe college would be different. Maybe adulthood would finally free me from the invisible cage of her favoritism. My brother had it all handed to him, not just her love but also her sacrifices, because she saved money for his basketball camps, bought him the newest sneakers every season, and even drove him across the state to tournaments while I pieced together second-hand clothes and tried to save babysitting money to buy my own laptop for school papers. I remember nights when I sat at the kitchen table writing essays longhand because our old computer froze constantly and she would pass by without a word on her way to help him pack his bag for another game. I told myself it didn't matter that words written on paper were still strong. But deep down I envied him, not just for the attention but for the confidence it gave him, because he grew up believing he was special while I grew up believing I was not enough. Graduation day should have been a moment of pride, but even then the spotlight landed on him because though we graduated together, my mum spent most of her time talking to relatives about his college scholarship while she barely mentioned my acceptance letter to a good university, as though it was just a footnote in his story. I stood there in my gown, smiling for photos, while inside I felt hollow and I wondered if she would ever see me without comparing me to him. When we packed for college, the difference showed again because she carefully folded his clothes into brand new suitcases and cried as she tucked notes into his pockets, while for me, she simply reminded me not to forget my toothbrush, and said she hoped I would manage on my own, and I did manage because I had been managing all along. In college, I finally felt a breath of freedom, a chance to build an identity outside of being the forgotten daughter. And I threw myself into classes, clubs, and writing projects, and for the first time, teachers and friends noticed me and praised me in ways that felt genuine. But every visit home brought me back into the same old story. Mum would ask about my grades, but her eyes would glaze over halfway through my sentences before lighting up again when my brother walked in to talk about his team or his social life, and I would shrink back into silence. It was around that time I began to realize that her obsession with him wasn't just favoritism, it was blindness. And that blindness would one day cost her something bigger than she could imagine, because while she believed he could do no wrong, I had already started noticing cracks in his perfect image. Small lies he told, money that seemed to disappear, late nights he never explained, and the smug way he brushed it off when I asked questions. I kept quiet because it wasn't my place, or maybe because I thought she would never believe me anyway, but a seed of knowing had been planted inside me, and it grew with every visit, every uneasy glance, until I could no longer ignore it. When I came home for summer break after my first year of college, the house felt the same, but I had changed, and I noticed details I used to ignore, like the way my mum's eyes followed my brother's every move, or how her voice softened whenever she spoke to him, while her tone with me was sharper, quicker, almost impatient, as if she was constantly in a rush to move past me and onto him. He was already different too, more arrogant, more careless about the rules that once seemed so important, and I saw how she ignored it when he stumbled home late at night smelling like beer, or when money vanished from her purse, and she convinced herself she must have misplaced it. I remember one evening when I was washing the dishes, and she was sitting at the table, pretending to read a magazine but really waiting for him to come back. And when the front door slammed, she leapt up with relief, even though it was well past midnight. And I stood there with wet hands, thinking she would never wait like that for me. I tried to talk to her once that summer. I told her gently that maybe she should be more careful, that he might be getting into trouble. But she cut me off, saying he was a good boy, and that I was just jealous like always. And those words burned deeper than she realized, because they reminded me that in her mind I was nothing more than the bitter sister trying to compete. After that I kept quiet, but I watched more closely, and the cracks grew wider, because his friends were shady, his grades were slipping, and sometimes I heard him arguing on the phone in hushed, angry tones while she busied herself in the kitchen pretending not to notice. I remember a night when he came home with a bruise on his cheek, and she gasped, fussed over him like he was a wounded hero, while I stood nearby and asked what had happened. And he snapped at me to mind my own business. And she told me not to provoke him, and in that moment, I realized she would defend him no matter what he did. It hurt, but it also gave me clarity, because I understood that her blind love was not protecting him, it was enabling him, and that sooner or later it would lead to something bigger, something that couldn't be hidden under excuses or brushed away with laughter. I started writing everything down in my journal, little notes about the lies I caught, the times he borrowed her car and came back with scratches, the way she handed him cash without question, while I scraped by on my part-time job. I wrote it all down not because I planned to expose him, but because it was the only way I could hold on to my sanity, the only way to remind myself that what I saw was real, even if she refused to see it. That summer taught me something important, that love without limits, without accountability, is not really love at all. It is a slow poison, and I could see it seeping into both of them. Him growing reckless and entitled, her growing blind and dependent, and me stuck in the middle trying to decide if I would stay silent forever, or if one day I would let the truth out no matter how much it hurt her. The turning point came one evening in late August when the heat clung to the walls of the house and the cicadas outside screamed so loudly it felt like they were inside my head, and I sat on the porch trying to read while Mum fussed over my brother in the kitchen preparing his favorite dinner as if he had just returned from war instead of from another night out with friends. He strolled in wearing a smirk and sunglasses even though the sun had already gone down, and I noticed how his hand shook slightly as he reached for a glass of water, but Mum didn't see it, or maybe she refused to see it, and instead she asked him if he was hungry, piling food onto his plate before he could even answer. I watched in silence, but later that night when I went upstairs to grab something from my room, I caught him rifling through Mum's jewelry box and my stomach dropped, because I knew then that this wasn't just carelessness or bad friends, this was betrayal at its rawest form. He froze when he saw me, and for a moment our eyes locked, and in his stare I saw no shame, only defiance, as if daring me to say something, and then he grinned, that same grin that used to charm her out of anger, and whispered, "Don't you dare," before slipping the necklace into his pocket. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run to her and shake her shoulders and force her to believe me, but I knew how that would go. She would accuse me of lying, of jealousy, of trying to ruin his life. So I swallowed it, and I let him pass, but the image burned into my brain, and I wrote it down in my journal that very night with shaking hands. Over the next weeks more little things went missing, money, trinkets, gift cards, and always when he was around. But she never suspected him. Instead, she blamed herself, said she must have misplaced them, or maybe even suggested that I had borrowed something and forgotten to return it, which cut deeper than I could explain. I didn't defend myself loudly because I knew arguing would only make her cling to him tighter, but inside I felt something cold settle in me, a kind of distance that told me one day I would stop protecting her from the truth. What hurt the most was how he looked at her after each lie with those soft eyes that convinced her he was innocent, and how she believed him without hesitation while I stood in the background, holding pieces of a puzzle she refused to see. It was in those moments that I realized betrayal isn't always sudden, sometimes it is slow, like water dripping into stone wearing it down, until one day it cracks, and I knew the crack was coming. I just didn't know when or how deep it would run. It all unraveled faster than I expected, and when it did, it felt both shocking and inevitable, like watching a storm form on the horizon, knowing it will hit but still flinching when the lightning strikes. One Saturday morning, Mum asked me to help her clean the living room before some relatives came over, and while I was vacuuming, I heard her gasp from the hallway, then her footsteps pounding up the stairs, and I followed to find her standing in my brother's room, holding an envelope with tears in her eyes. Inside were credit card statements, pages and pages of charges she didn't recognize, restaurants, gas stations, electronics, all in her name, and I saw her lips tremble as she whispered, "He wouldn't do this to me," but I knew he had. She confronted him that night, and I will never forget the scene because he didn't even bother to deny it. He just rolled his eyes and said he needed the money, and she would understand if she really loved him. Her face crumbled at those words, and she begged him to explain, begged him to tell her it wasn't as bad as it looked, but he snapped back that she had always given him everything, and why should this be any different? I stood in the doorway, my hand shaking, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and a strange vindication, because finally she saw what I had seen all along. But even then she tried to excuse him. She said maybe his friends had pressured him, maybe it was just a mistake, and I wanted to scream that no, this wasn't pressure or mistakes, this was a choice he made again and again because he knew she would forgive him. That night I heard her crying in her room, muffled sobs that seeped through the walls, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel invisible. I felt heavy with the weight of knowing that her golden boy had finally shattered the pedestal she built for him. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering every time she had dismissed me, every time she had brushed aside my achievements, and I wondered if she was thinking about those moments too, if she was realizing that the daughter she had ignored was the one who never betrayed her. while the son she worshipped was the one who broke her heart. There was a strange kind of justice in it, but also a deep sadness, because even though I had longed for her to see the truth, I never wanted it to come at the cost of her trust, her sense of safety, her belief in her own family. Betrayal has a way of changing the air in a house, and in the days that followed, the silence between them was louder than any shouting could have been, and for the first time I watched my mum move through the rooms like a ghost, unsure of what was real anymore. In the weeks after she discovered the credit card debt, the house felt like it was balancing on a knife edge, and every sound carried too much weight, like the creak of his bedroom door in the middle of the night, or the slam of the fridge when he came home late, and she would flinch though she still tried to act like everything was normal. Cooking his favorite meals, leaving clean laundry folded on his bed, as if rituals could erase betrayal. But I saw the fear in her eyes each time she glanced at him, and I knew the blind love she once had was slipping away. One evening I came home from my part-time job and found her sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by bills with her head in her hands, and the light from the overhead lamp made her look older than I had ever seen her, and she whispered almost to herself, "I don't know how to fix this," and I wanted to tell her that she couldn't fix it. Not this time, but the words stuck in my throat because she still wasn't ready to let go. My brother walked in moments later smelling like alcohol, and without hesitation he demanded more money, saying he needed to pay someone back, and when she told him she didn't have any left, he slammed his fist against the wall so hard the picture frame rattled, and I felt the old fear I used to carry return. But this time mixed with anger, because I couldn't believe she was still giving him space to treat her that way. Later that night she came into my room, and for the first time in years she sat on my bed like she used to when I was a child, and she asked me quietly, "What should I do?" And I almost didn't know how to answer because I had waited so long to hear her admit the truth, but hearing it broke something in me too. I told her she needed to stop covering for him, that she had to protect herself before he dragged her down further, and her eyes filled with tears as she admitted that she had always loved him more, and she didn't know why she couldn't stop even now. That confession cut me deeply because it was what I had known all along, but to hear her say it out loud felt like both a wound and a strange kind of healing. For days after that conversation she moved differently, more cautious around him, less eager to please. But he noticed and he didn't like it, and soon the tension exploded into shouting matches, doors slamming, and nights when he didn't come home at all. I stayed close to her then, trying to shield her in ways she had never shielded me, because despite everything she was still my mother, and seeing her broken was not the revenge I had imagined it would be. It was just sad and lonely, and I realized that betrayal doesn't just hurt the person it's aimed at, it ripples outward, touching everyone in its path. The night everything truly collapsed was colder than it should have been for early fall, and the air inside the house felt heavy, as if it already knew what was about to happen. And I remember sitting at the desk in my room trying to study, when I heard shouting from downstairs. My brother's voice sharp and angry, my mother's voice trembling and breaking like glass, and I rushed down only to find them standing in the living room, her clutching her purse to her chest and him demanding that she hand it over. She kept saying she had nothing left, that everything was gone because of him, but he didn't believe her, or maybe he didn't care, and he reached for the purse while she held on with both hands, and I saw fear in her eyes that I had never seen before, not even when we were kids and she was scolding me. It was pure fear of her own son, and for a second the room spun because I couldn't understand how it had come to this. I shouted at him to stop, but he only glared at me and told me to stay out of it, and in that moment I realized he wasn't my brother anymore. He was someone else, someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of hurting the woman who had loved him more than anyone. He ripped the purse from her hands and the contents spilled across the floor. Bills, coins, a half-empty pack of gum, and the sight of her standing there trembling while he knelt down to scoop up the money burned itself into my memory forever. Something inside me snapped then, and I stepped forward, yanking the cash from his hands and shoving him back harder than I ever thought I could, and I told him to get out and never come back. For a second he looked shocked, but then his face twisted into that same mocking grin and he muttered, "You'll regret this," before storming out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. My mother sank to the floor sobbing, and I knelt beside her holding her shaking shoulders, and for the first time she clung to me instead of him, whispering over and over, "I can't believe he did this, I can't believe it," and I realized she was finally seeing what I had seen all along. The house was silent after that except for her cries and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. That night I sat by her bed until she fell asleep, and I promised myself that no matter what happened next, I would not let her fall apart completely, because even if she had failed me for years, I couldn't let her destroy herself over him. But, deep inside, I also knew his betrayal was not finished. It was only beginning, and the fallout would stretch far beyond one stolen purse. In the days after he stormed out, the house felt unnervingly quiet, as though every wall was holding its breath waiting for the next blow to land, and Mum drifted from room to room like a ghost, sometimes picking up his old basketball jersey, pressing it to her face and crying, while other times she would slam drawers shut, muttering about how she had been blind, how she had given him everything, only to be repaid with lies and theft. I tried to keep her grounded, cooking small meals, sitting with her at the table, reminding her to pay the bills on time, because so much of her attention had been wrapped around him for so long that now without him she didn't seem to know what to do with herself. But he didn't disappear completely. He started calling at odd hours, demanding more money, saying vague things about debts and people who were after him, and I would hear her voice tremble on the phone as she told him she had nothing left, yet still promised she would try to find a way, and each time I wanted to snatch the phone from her hand and hang up, but I couldn't bring myself to cause her more pain. One night he showed up at the door, bruised and desperate, asking to come inside, and she hesitated for the first time in her life, but finally opened the door and let him in, and he collapsed on the couch begging for forgiveness, telling her he had made mistakes, but that he could fix it if she just helped him one more time. I watched her face torn between the mother who wanted to believe him and the woman who knew she had been betrayed, and I realized she was standing on a line she couldn't balance on much longer. I pulled her aside and told her this had to stop, that every time she gave him another chance she was only digging herself deeper, and for once she didn't argue, she just cried silently and asked me how a mother could stop loving her own child, and I didn't know how to answer, because even after everything, I couldn't imagine turning off love like a switch. That night when he left again, she turned to me with red swollen eyes and whispered, "I think I lost my son." And the way she said it made me shiver, because it was the first time she admitted that he wasn't coming back to who he once was. I held her hand in the dark kitchen and I thought about all the years she had loved him more than me, all the years I had longed for her to see me, and in that moment I realized I didn't need her to admit it anymore, because life had already forced her to. The golden boy had fallen, and the pieces were sharp enough to cut both of us. The breaking point came on a rainy evening when the streets outside shone with reflections of streetlights and the sound of thunder rolled in the distance, and I sat at the kitchen table going over schoolwork, when the front door burst open, and my brother stumbled in, dripping wet, his eyes wild and his hands trembling, as he slammed the door behind him and locked it. Mum jumped up from the couch startled, and he blurted out that he was in trouble, real trouble, that someone was after him, and he needed money now, not tomorrow, not next week, but right now. I felt my stomach twist because I could see the panic in his eyes, but also the manipulation, the same tone he had always used to get what he wanted. Mum rushed to him instinctively, asking if he was hurt, reaching for his face like she always did, and I wanted to pull her back because I could see he was beyond saving. He ranted about owing people money, about being threatened, and how everything would be fine if she just gave him what little she had left, but when she told him there was nothing more to give, His voice turned sharp and ugly, and he accused her of abandoning him, of never supporting him the way he needed. And I could not believe the words because she had given him her entire soul. I stood up then and told him to stop, that he had taken enough from her and from this family, and his eyes flicked to me with a hatred I had never seen before, and for a split second I thought he might actually lash out. Mum cried and begged us both to calm down, but I felt something harden inside me, as I told him he wasn't welcome here anymore, not until he fixed his life and faced the consequences of what he had done. He laughed bitterly, threw his wet jacket onto the floor, and said we would both regret pushing him away, then stormed back into the night, leaving the door swinging open to the storm. Mum collapsed into the chair, sobbing so hard her whole body shook, and I closed the door and sat beside her, my own hands trembling, as I realized that no matter how many second chances she had given him, it would never be enough for him. And for the first time she seemed to see that too. The storm outside raged on, and inside I felt both relief and grief tangled together, because part of me had waited years for her to finally see the truth, and yet watching her heart shatter like that was nothing like the justice I once imagined. After that night, things changed in ways I never thought possible, because for the first time my mum stopped defending him and started defending herself. And it was both painful and powerful to watch as she cancelled the credit cards, closed the bank account he used, and even changed the locks on the front door. Though she cried the entire time she turned the key in her hand, as if she was locking out a part of her own heart. The house felt emptier without him, but also safer, and I could breathe in a way I hadn't since childhood yet. Mum wandered through the days like someone learning to walk again, stumbling on memories and falling into tears at the smallest reminders, like finding his old sneakers under the bed, or hearing a basketball game on TV. I sat with her through those moments, and sometimes she would take my hand and whisper, "I should have loved you more," and I never knew whether to feel comforted or wounded, because those words were the truth I had carried like a scar, and hearing her admit it out loud was both healing and cruel. Weeks passed and he would still call from different numbers, sometimes threatening, sometimes begging, sometimes promising he had changed, and she would sit frozen listening to the phone ring until I picked it up and told him never to call again. She hated hearing me speak to him that way, but deep down she knew it was necessary because she could not resist his voice and I could not let him sink her again. One night I found her in the kitchen, staring at an old photo of him as a child, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling as though nothing could break them, and she asked me through tears, "Do you think he ever loved me?" And I didn't know what to say, because love twisted by entitlement and selfishness no longer feels like love at all. I told her what she needed to hear, that he did love her once, but somewhere along the way he chose something else, and that choice was his, not hers. And she nodded slowly, as if holding on to those words like a lifeline. For the first time I felt like she saw me not just as the daughter who had been overlooked, but as the person standing beside her when the golden boy she adored had turned to shadows. The final break came months later when a letter arrived in the mail from a county jail with my brother's name scrawled across the front, and my mother's hand shook as she opened it and read his desperate words asking for bail money, forgiveness, another chance. And I watched her eyes flicker between love and exhaustion before she finally set the paper down and whispered, "I can't do this anymore." For years I had dreamed of hearing her say those words, dreamed of the day she would finally see what her blind devotion had cost her. But when it finally happened, it didn't feel like victory, it felt like grief layered upon grief. She cried that night not for the son who betrayed her but for the years she lost, pouring everything into someone who could not hold it, and I sat beside her holding her hand, realizing that the roles had reversed, that I was now the one keeping her steady the way she had never managed to keep me. I thought about all the birthdays where I was overlooked, the contests where my victories went unnoticed, the endless nights of silence while she adored him, and for a moment bitterness rose in me like bile, but then I looked at her weary face, and I felt something different, not revenge, not triumph, but clarity. Her betrayal of me had been neglect, his betrayal of her had been destruction, and somewhere in the wreckage we were left with each other, raw and flawed but still standing. We never wrote back to him, and weeks later another letter came, then another, until finally they stopped, and the silence that followed was almost peaceful. Slowly she began to notice me in ways she never had before, asking about my writing, sitting with me over coffee, listening without drifting away, and sometimes she would apologize again, tears in her eyes, saying she wished she could undo the past, but I told her we could only move forward. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word for what I gave her, because the scars of those years will always remain, but I chose not to let bitterness rule me anymore. The truth is, I got my revenge not by shouting, not by exposing him, but by simply surviving long enough for the truth to reveal itself, and when it did, she finally saw me. My brother was her golden boy until the gold wore off, and what was left was nothing but betrayal, and in the end the daughter she overlooked was the one who stayed. That is the story of how I lost a brother I never truly had, and gained a mother who finally learned to see me.